The wind whispered through the gnarled pines of Alabama, carrying with it the faint scent of decay and something more, unnatural. In 1907, a man known only as the Doctor arrived at the edge of a forgotten forest, his carriage creaking under the weight of mysterious crates and dark secrets. No one knew where he had come from, but the locals sensed immediately that he did not belong. He claimed to hold knowledge that could purify sin, to cure what generations of whispered rumors had marked as hereditary evil, but they said nothing, watching from behind shuttered windows as he disappeared among the trees. At night, strange lights flickered in the canopy, casting long, unnatural shadows that danced across the forest floor. Families spoke in hushed tones of children who wandered too far, never to return, of livestock found torn or hollowed, of sounds that were neither wind nor animal but something in between. Some swore they glimpsed figures moving behind the trees, with faces that were almost human yet not quite right, staring through the darkness with empty, intelligent eyes. Inside the Doctor's secluded cabin, he worked tirelessly. Candles flickered over pages of fevered notes, sketches of forms both human and other, outlines of a theory no one dared to question. He whispered to his creations in the small hours, coaxing life from his grotesque experiments, shaping hybrids meant to embody perfection, yet bearing all the horror of unnatural birth. The forest seemed to breathe with him, alive and watchful, as if the trees themselves were witnesses to crimes unspoken. Whispers of the Doctor's deeds began to seep into the town like a creeping fog. Travelers spoke of strange screams and fleeting shadows that moved too deliberately to be mere wildlife. A few bold souls ventured into the forest, drawn by curiosity or duty, only to return shaken, unable to fully articulate what they had seen, something that was human and yet monstrously altered, hiding in the undergrowth and watching. Even now, more than a century later, the forest holds its secrets. The Doctor's name is barely remembered, but the lingering terror of his experiments endures in the rustling of the pines, in the hollow spaces where children once played, and in the quiet thought that perhaps the hybrids never truly vanished. In 1907, deep in the heart of Alabama, a man known simply as the Doctor arrived at the edge of a dense, ancient forest, bringing with him an air of quiet menace and curiosity that unsettled the local townsfolk. He was a figure cloaked in mystery, his background shrouded in obscurity. Rumors hinted at strange medical practices and forbidden studies undertaken in distant cities, yet no one could confirm the truth. His appearance was striking yet disarming, tall and thin, with a pallid complexion and piercing eyes that seemed to measure the moral fiber of anyone who dared meet his gaze. He rented a small, decaying cabin on the outskirts of the woods, a place locals instinctively avoided, claiming it was cursed or that the shadows around it moved in ways the human eye could not follow. Despite the eerie reputation of the area, the Doctor carried himself with an almost magnetic calm, speaking in a soft, deliberate tone that suggested both intelligence and authority, as though he were quietly inviting the world to question the boundaries of what was natural. He proclaimed to anyone who would listen that he had discovered a way to address a hereditary curse that plagued families, a curse carried silently from one generation to the next through bloodlines, and he claimed he could cure it through the careful manipulation of human biology. This declaration drew skepticism and fear in equal measure, yet a few of the more desperate or credulous townspeople found themselves intrigued, wondering if there might be truth in his words. The Doctor wasted no time establishing himself in the forest, surveying its contours and studying its hidden clearings as though he were both a caretaker and an intruder, learning which areas could serve his purposes without drawing unwanted attention. His presence immediately disrupted the fragile equilibrium of the town. Children whispered about glimpses of a gaunt figure at twilight, moving among the trees, and neighbors reported strange lights and sounds echoing from the forest long after nightfall. The Doctor, however, seemed unconcerned by their murmurs, moving with a purpose and meticulous precision that suggested he was following a plan only he understood. Locals could not shake the sense that he was not simply a doctor in the conventional sense but a man who believed himself capable of rewriting the natural order, of bending the line between morality and science in ways that no one had dared attempt before. He began acquiring rare tools, vials of substances that glimmered like captured moonlight, and manuscripts filled with cryptic diagrams, all of which hinted at experiments far beyond ordinary medical practice. Despite the warnings and growing unease, he maintained an outward demeanor of civility, offering polite greetings and occasional assistance to travelers, all while quietly preparing for a series of actions that would soon cast a long shadow over the region and leave the forest itself forever marked by his presence. Soon after the doctor settled at the edge of the forest, whispers began to ripple through the nearby town, carried by nervous voices and curious onlookers who watched from behind shuttered windows. At first, these murmurs were small and easily dismissed. Children claimed to have seen strange figures moving between the trees, couples reported fleeting shadows that seemed too deliberate to belong to wildlife, and a few travelers mentioned lights flickering in the forest at odd hours, pale and ghostly, casting long, unnatural shapes across the undergrowth. Yet as the night stretched on, the rumors intensified, and a palpable unease settled over the townsfolk, thickening the air with suspicion and fear. Mothers clutched their children closer, warning them not to wander too far, and even the men who prided themselves on courage felt an inexplicable chill whenever the forest loomed in their line of sight. Livestock began disappearing with alarming frequency, leaving behind only torn fences and signs of struggle, but no traces of predator tracks. Theories circulated wildly. Some claimed the forest itself was cursed, others insisted a pack of wolves or some unknown beast was responsible, while the more cautious spoke of human interference, though no one could imagine what sort of person would live so deeply in the woods. As the rumors spread, they began to intertwine with the doctor's growing notoriety. People who had seen him on the outskirts of town described him as pale and unflinching, moving with an unsettling calm, carrying crates or bundles whose contents were never revealed. His presence seemed almost to confirm the whispered fears, and speculation mounted that he had a hand in the unexplained events. Those brave enough to venture near the forest reported a strange stillness that settled over the trees at dusk, a silence so profound it felt unnatural, broken only by the faintest rustle or the occasional distant scream that could not be clearly identified. Occasionally, children were noticed missing for hours, found later at the edge of the woods with eyes wide and haunted, unable or unwilling to explain where they had been. Some said they had glimpsed figures watching them from the shadows, figures that moved with jerky, unnatural motions and seemed neither wholly human nor animal. The fear in the town grew steadily, transforming curiosity into suspicion and hesitation into outright terror. Town gatherings buzzed with speculation, neighbors whispered warnings, and even the local authorities felt a creeping sense of powerlessness, unable to confirm anything tangible yet acutely aware that something sinister had taken root among the trees. Every unexplained sound, every glimmer of light beyond the tree line, every sudden disappearance strengthened the belief that the forest had become a place of unnatural occurrence, a living mirror of the doctor's hidden intentions, and a place where the line between science, morality, and nightmare was beginning to blur in ways no one could yet fully comprehend. The first experiment marked the beginning of a darkness that would forever stain the forest and haunt the surrounding town. The doctor, meticulous and methodical, had spent weeks observing families whose bloodlines were intertwined over generations, convinced that their hereditary connections carried a hidden corruption he alone could correct. He approached them with a deceptive charm, presenting himself as a healer capable of ridding their lineage of illness, weakness, and sin. Some of the more desperate or naive families, driven by fear of inherited afflictions and the doctor's persuasive assurances, agreed to participate, unaware of the true nature of his work. Once the families were within his isolated cabin, the doctor began his experiments, carefully isolating subjects, monitoring their interactions, and documenting each reaction with an obsessive precision. He carried instruments that hummed and glimmered under candlelight, devices designed to manipulate the human body in ways that blurred the line between science and unnatural ritual. His notebooks were filled with detailed sketches, anatomical diagrams, and calculations that tracked bloodlines and genetic combinations, all intended to guide him toward what he described as a perfect human synthesis. The experiments themselves were cruel and methodical. Couples were kept under strict observation, their every action and reaction noted, while the doctor administered potions and compounds designed to alter development and inheritance. Those subjected to his procedures became increasingly anxious and fearful, sensing that something fundamental about life itself was being violated. Whispers among the captive families grew, their collective dread forming an unspoken resistance that the doctor viewed as both a challenge and a necessary variable in his calculations. Children who were present often cried inconsolably, their innocence unable to reconcile the strange, clinical rituals unfolding before them. Yet the doctor remained unwavering, convinced that his work was not only justified but sacred, that he was a pioneer standing at the threshold of a moral and biological revolution. Over time, the Doctor's first human hybrids began to emerge, small and fragile at first, their features slightly askew, their expressions marked by an unsettling intelligence that seemed out of place for their age. He treated them not as children but as experiments, subjects to be measured, observed, and refined according to his meticulous standards. Each success fueled his obsession, and each failure was catalogued with clinical detachment, yet even his careful notes could not capture the growing sense of horror that emanated from the creatures themselves. Locals began noticing faint, unnatural movements within the forest and strange cries that pierced the night, the sounds of the Doctor's first creations wandering under the trees, learning, watching, and adapting in ways he had not fully anticipated. The town's unease intensified, and fear began to settle like a permanent shadow, for the boundaries of normalcy had been broken, and the Doctor's work had begun to cast its first, inescapable pall over the land. As the Doctor's experiments progressed, the first true hybrids began to emerge, and with them came a horror that even he had not fully anticipated. These children, born from carefully selected pairings of closely related families, were neither fully human in appearance nor entirely predictable in behavior. Their features were distorted in subtle but unmistakable ways, eyes that seemed too large or too sharp, limbs that bent at odd angles, and expressions that could shift from innocent curiosity to something almost predatory in an instant. Yet despite their grotesque form, they possessed a startling intelligence, an unnatural awareness of the world around them that gave them a chilling presence. The Doctor regarded them with a mixture of scientific pride and obsession, meticulously recording their development, noting every deviation from the human norm, and adjusting his methods in pursuit of an imagined perfection. He referred to them not by name but by numbers or cryptic codes, emphasizing their status as subjects rather than children, as if stripping them of identity would make the moral implications of his work easier to bear. The hybrids themselves, however, began to demonstrate an unsettling agency. Some would imitate the Doctor's mannerisms or mimic voices they had overheard, while others seemed to understand the limits of the forest and the cabin, navigating the shadows with a precision that suggested they were learning far more quickly than their age would suggest. Occasionally, they would vanish from the Doctor's sight for hours, only to return with inexplicable injuries or signs that they had been exploring the woods in ways no ordinary child could survive. Their presence brought an atmosphere of tension to the Doctor's secluded cabin, where the air grew heavy with the scent of decay and the faint metallic tang of chemicals used in his experiments. Nights became the most dangerous hours, as the hybrid's movements could be heard in the darkness, scraping, whispering, and occasionally shrill cries that seemed to echo with both fear and intelligence. The local townsfolk, already uneasy from rumors of disappearances and strange lights in the forest, began to report sightings that could only be described as unnerving. Figures with human-like shapes moved too deliberately in the shadows, appearing at the edge of fields or along the winding paths of the forest, then vanishing as suddenly as they appeared. Children playing near the outskirts would sometimes claim to have seen funny-looking kids staring at them with unsettling focus, their eyes too knowing, too calculating for innocence. Livestock disappeared more frequently, and faint footprints of unnatural size and shape were found pressed into the soft earth. The Doctor, obsessed with his pursuit, dismissed the townspeople's fears as superstition, yet the reality of what he had created began to seep beyond the walls of his cabin, carrying with it a quiet, pervasive terror that the forest itself seemed to hold in its boughs, as if the very trees were aware of the unnatural life that now moved silently among them. As the unnatural phenomena in the forest continued, outsiders began to take notice, drawn by whispers of disappearances and strange occurrences that defied rational explanation. A traveling journalist, whose curiosity had been piqued by rumors circulating in nearby towns, arrived with the intent of uncovering the truth, armed with little more than a notebook, a lantern, and a growing sense of foreboding. Others spoke of a local lawman who had grown suspicious after hearing consistent reports of missing children and unusual lights flickering through the trees at night. These figures moved cautiously, aware that they were entering a realm where normal rules seemed suspended, and yet compelled by a mix of duty and morbid fascination to seek answers. They began to question the townspeople, gathering fragments of stories that painted a picture of an unseen presence manipulating life in ways that no ordinary human could. The forest seemed to respond to their intrusion, the wind whispering warnings through the pines, leaves rustling with sounds that could have been voices or the echo of distant footsteps, and shadows deepening in corners where lantern light barely reached. As they ventured closer to the doctor's secluded cabin, they noticed subtle anomalies, broken branches that suggested deliberate movement, disturbed undergrowth forming trails that could not be attributed to animals, and fleeting glimpses of figures darting between trees with uncanny agility. Their suspicions inevitably turned toward the doctor, whose reputation as a healer and learned man had initially cloaked him in respectability. Eyewitness accounts described him moving through the forest at dusk, carrying crates and bundles whose contents remained hidden, and the precision of his movements suggested not just purpose, but an intimate knowledge of the terrain that no ordinary resident possessed. The journalist and the lawman began to piece together a disturbing pattern: the timing of the strange lights, the disappearances, and the doctor's presence all aligned too perfectly to be coincidental. At night, the forest seemed to grow more alive in response to their scrutiny. The hybrids, though largely unseen, became aware of these intrusions, observing from shadows with an intelligence that unsettled even the most rational of outsiders. Strange cries echoed intermittently, accompanied by the sound of small, deliberate footsteps over dead leaves and soft earth. Even the most hardened of the locals could not ignore the evidence, and the outsider's presence intensified a growing sense of dread, as if the doctor's creations themselves were aware of threats approaching their hidden world. The journalist documented every detail, capturing the eerie interplay of natural and unnatural, while the lawman attempted to trace footprints and tracks, each discovery further confirming that something far beyond ordinary comprehension was unfolding within the forest's dark heart. The boundary between observer and participant blurred with every step deeper into the woods, and it became increasingly clear that those who sought to uncover the doctor's secrets might awaken forces they were neither prepared for nor capable of controlling. As the weeks wore on, the unease in the town escalated into a tangible fear that seemed to seep into every home and street. Livestock continued to vanish under mysterious circumstances, often leaving behind only blooded patches of earth or partially eaten carcasses that no predator could have produced. Windows rattled at night with gusts of wind that carried faint, unidentifiable cries, while the shadows of the forest seemed to stretch unnaturally toward the town, reaching like dark fingers into the imagination of anyone brave enough to glance outside. Children whispered about seeing figures with oddly contorted limbs moving silently among the trees, and even those too young to articulate the danger felt the oppressive weight of something unseen observing them. The forest itself appeared to pulse with life, the canopy swaying though no wind blew, as if the trees were aware and complicit in the events that had begun to unfold. The locals, long accustomed to the rhythms of rural life, began to notice subtle changes in one another, a shared tension that manifested in nervous glances and hurried steps. Conversations that once revolved around crops or weather shifted toward whispered warnings about the doctor and his secluded cabin in the woods. Mothers would clutch their children and drag them home at dusk, while fathers lingered at the edges of the forest, peering into the darkness with unease. Even the bravest among them began to feel that the line between the natural and the unnatural had been breached, that the forest no longer belonged solely to the world of familiar animals and plants but was now occupied by something far stranger. Strange lights flickered deep within the trees, sometimes glowing in soft, almost hypnotic colors, at other times flaring violently before vanishing entirely. Shadows moved independently of any solid object, shifting with a purpose that suggested intelligence, and soft, deliberate noises echoed in the underbrush, the source never fully revealed. Stories of vanished children began to circulate more openly, tales of young boys and girls who wandered too far from home and were never seen again, or returned days later with hollow eyes and expressions that suggested they had witnessed horrors beyond understanding. Adults reported strange interactions with the hybrids, creatures that moved like children but possessed an uncanny awareness, responding to questions before they were fully asked, imitating voices and gestures, and retreating into the forest when confronted. Even the doctor's presence in town became a source of fear rather than curiosity. Sightings of him carrying crates and muttering to himself only strengthened the belief that the unnatural events were orchestrated, that his experiments had taken on a life beyond his control. The boundary between science and superstition blurred as the forest itself seemed to participate in the escalating tension, the air heavy with anticipation and dread, and the town's collective consciousness became dominated by a single, pervasive question. What exactly had the doctor awakened within the depths of the trees, And how far would the consequences reach before anyone could intervene? As the doctor's experiments continued, his obsession grew to a level that consumed every waking thought, leaving little room for reason or morality. He no longer regarded the hybrids simply as experiments but as the raw material for a vision that had taken on a fevered, almost religious intensity. Each deviation from the human norm, each anomaly in their development, became for him a clue, a step closer to what he considered a perfected human form. His days blurred into nights, filled with meticulous observation, measurements, and the administration of strange compounds designed to accelerate growth, sharpen cognition, or manipulate physical traits in ways that defied the natural order. He spoke to the hybrids constantly, not with tenderness but with an analytical precision, instructing them, testing them, molding them into what he envisioned as the ultimate expression of his theories. When they faltered or resisted, he reacted not with anger but with the cold detachment of someone who believed that failure was merely a variable to be corrected, a misstep in the inexorable path toward perfection. The doctor's mind became increasingly unhinged, consumed by the idea that moral transgressions, hereditary flaws, and human weakness could all be corrected through the manipulation of blood and form. He began to withdraw almost entirely from the outside world, speaking rarely to townspeople and dismissing any attempt at inquiry with a polite but firm deflection. In the cabin, the air grew thick with the odors of chemicals and antiseptics, mingling with the faint, unsettling scent of the hybrids themselves, creatures whose very presence had begun to alter the atmosphere of the forest. Night after night, he would pace among them, observing their reactions to stimuli, cataloguing their intelligence, and adjusting his methods with meticulous care, convinced that each alteration brought him closer to realizing a vision that only he could comprehend. The hybrids themselves seemed to respond to the doctor's growing intensity, some displaying startling comprehension and mimicry, while others developed behaviors that were unpredictable and increasingly disturbing. Their eyes, wide and alert, followed him constantly, and at times, they seemed to anticipate his actions, moving in ways that suggested not instinct but calculated reasoning. Occasionally, a hybrid would retreat into the forest for hours, returning with scratches, bruises, or a newfound skill that hinted at experiences the doctor had neither orchestrated nor observed. Despite the doctor's brilliance, he could not fully control the results of his own work, and in his relentless pursuit, he began to blur the line between creator and observer, between orchestrator and participant in a world that was evolving beyond his complete understanding. Meanwhile, the surrounding forest seemed to react to the intensifying obsession. Sounds of movement, whispers of unnatural voices, and flickering lights grew more frequent and pronounced, hinting at a consciousness emerging among the hybrids and the land itself. The doctor's obsession created a tension that extended beyond the walls of his cabin, infiltrating the forest and the edges of the town, a silent warning that the consequences of his actions were spreading, and that his pursuit of perfection carried with it the potential for a horror that could no longer be contained. Eventually, the boundaries between secrecy and exposure began to crumble when the hidden laboratory at the heart of the doctor's domain was discovered. The journalist and the local lawman, driven by a mixture of determination and dread, had been following faint clues for weeks, broken branches forming suspicious trails, footprints that did not belong to any known animal, and intermittent glimpses of figures moving with unnerving precision through the undergrowth. Their instincts told them that the answers to the town's growing fears lay deeper in the forest than anyone had dared to venture. After days of careful observation, they stumbled upon what appeared to be a concealed entrance, partially obscured by overgrown vines and the natural shadow of the trees. The sight of the cabin had always inspired unease, but this hidden doorway, almost invisible unless one knew precisely where to look, suggested that the doctor's work went far beyond the eccentricity of a recluse and into the realm of something profoundly unnatural. Inside the lab, the air was thick and pungent, carrying the combined odors of chemicals, antiseptics, and a faint, indefinable human tang. Shelves were lined with vials of strange liquids, jars containing preserved organs, and instruments whose purpose was only hinted at in the doctor's meticulous notes. The walls were covered with diagrams that mapped bloodlines and hybrid forms, sketches depicting anatomical alterations and theoretical constructs that blurred the line between human and something far stranger. The hybrids themselves were partially confined, some curled in small, unnatural nests, others observing the intruders with unsettling intelligence, their eyes sharp, alert, and calculating. Their presence filled the room with a silent menace, as if they were evaluating the intruders as carefully as the doctor evaluated them. The two outsiders began to sift through the evidence, each discovery compounding the horror. There were journals filled with feverish writing, detailing experiments that manipulated heredity with clinical detachment, yet imbued with a disturbing moral justification. Some notes recorded the responses of the hybrids to specific stimuli, while others outlined future experiments, showing an ambition that had grown steadily more dangerous with each passing day. The room seemed alive, every shadow and flicker of candlelight suggesting movement where there should have been none. Even the objects in the laboratory, the instruments, the jars, the sketches, felt charged with an energy that was both intellectual and profoundly malevolent. The realization struck both the journalist and the lawman with a chilling clarity. The doctor's creations were not mere aberrations of science but living manifestations of obsession made flesh, and his work had gone far beyond anything that could be contained by secrecy. The laboratory was not just a site of experimentation but a locus of unnatural life, a place where morality, science, and terror had converged in ways that could not be undone. In that moment, it became impossible to separate the doctor's intellect from his madness, or the hybrids from the growing, inescapable horror that now extended into the forest and threatened to spill beyond its borders. Tension in the town reached a breaking point when the locals, driven by fear and outrage, decided they could no longer ignore the doctor's growing influence and the sinister presence of his creations. Whispers of the doctor's atrocities had circulated long enough to galvanize a group of men and women who had witnessed too many disappearances, heard too many cries from the forest, and glimpsed too many unnatural shapes moving through the trees. Fueled by a mixture of desperation and righteous anger, they armed themselves with whatever tools and weapons they could find, pitchforks, axes, and rifles, and ventured into the forest with a grim determination to confront the man who had brought terror to their lives. The air was thick with anticipation, each rustle of leaves and snapping of twigs setting their nerves on edge, as if the forest itself were aware of the confrontation that was about to unfold. The closer they drew to the doctor's cabin, the more pronounced the signs of his unnatural experiments became: footprints that bent unnaturally, broken branches arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence, and faint, whispering sounds that carried with them the echo of the hybrid's presence. Inside the cabin, the doctor was oblivious to the approach of the townsfolk, entirely consumed by his obsession. The hybrids, sensing movement outside, shifted uneasily, their wide, alert eyes scanning for intruders. Some of them moved silently through hidden corridors and passages, testing their abilities and instincts against the threat they had learned to recognize. When the confrontation finally occurred, it was chaotic and overwhelming. The doctor attempted to reason with the townsfolk, insisting that his work was for the greater good, that he was on the brink of a discovery that could erase hereditary flaws and purify the bloodline. But his words fell on deaf ears, drowned out by fear, rage, and the realization that his experiments had produced beings that defied morality and nature itself. In the ensuing turmoil, violence erupted. The hybrids, previously contained within the cabin, reacted instinctively, some fleeing into the surrounding forest while others defended the doctor with unnerving cunning. Screams pierced the night as the townsfolk struggled to navigate the labyrinthine interior of the laboratory, tripping over hidden apparatus, overturned tables, and the unnatural forms of the hybrids. The doctor, frantic and unhinged, attempted to control the chaos, his intellect now in conflict with the very creatures he had created. By the time the confrontation ended, the cabin was partially destroyed, and several hybrids had escaped into the forest, their unnatural intelligence allowing them to vanish into the dense trees with ease. In the aftermath, the forest seemed to absorb the echoes of the chaos, carrying them through the undergrowth like a living memory of what had transpired. The doctor disappeared from the area, leaving behind a scene of devastation, and the townsfolk returned with both relief and lingering fear, aware that the hybrids they had glimpsed might still roam freely. The events of that night left a permanent scar on the community, a deepening sense that the boundaries between human and unnatural life had been shattered, and that the forest now harbored secrets far darker than anyone had ever imagined. Even decades after the doctor vanished and the chaos of that fateful night subsided, the forest retained a reputation steeped in fear and whispered warnings. Locals spoke cautiously of the woods, never venturing far past the familiar paths, always alert to movement in the shadows or the faintest rustle that might signal the presence of something unnatural. The hybrids, now grown and dispersed, were said to roam silently among the trees, their unnatural intelligence allowing them to blend seamlessly with the undergrowth while observing intruders from a distance. Those who claimed to have glimpsed them described forms that were almost human but with subtle distortions, a flicker of too sharp eyes, a movement too deliberate, a voice that carried a hollow mimicry of humanity. Even the bravest travelers reported chills running down their spines as they passed through the forest, certain they were being watched, certain that something inhuman was tracking their every step. The legacy of the doctor's work became intertwined with the natural rhythms of the forest. The air carried a faint, almost imperceptible tension, a lingering awareness of the unnatural life that had once been confined to a cabin now long abandoned and overgrown. Trees seemed to bend slightly toward the paths of travelers, leaves whispered with faint, eerie cadence, and the sounds of distant movement, branches snapping, footsteps crunching on dead leaves, persisted long after nightfall. Animals, too, seemed affected. Birds avoided certain clearings, and livestock kept near the forest's edge displayed a nervousness that suggested instinctive recognition of the lingering presence of the hybrids. Townsfolk passed down tales of faint lights appearing at dusk, glimpses of figures vanishing as quickly as they appeared, and cries that carried no clear source yet resonated with a tone of intelligence and awareness. These stories became a part of local folklore, passed from parent to child, blending fear with curiosity, a warning woven into the cultural memory of the region. Even the forest's geography seemed subtly altered by the presence of the doctor's experiments. Hidden hollows, tunnels, and partially concealed clearings suggested spaces where hybrids might take refuge or observe the world without revealing themselves. Over time, these areas became mythologized, considered cursed or haunted, yet no one could fully confirm the nature of the phenomena, leaving the forest a place of perpetual speculation and unease. Outsiders occasionally tried to explore, drawn by curiosity or the allure of discovery, but few stayed long. Most retreated, unnerved by the sense that they were intruding into a living intelligence, an ecosystem warped by the doctor's ambition and the hybrid's quiet persistence. The town itself bore scars as well, subtle and psychological, in the form of lingering suspicion, cautious interactions, and a pervasive sense that some secret continued to watch from the edges of the woods. Even as generations passed, parents warned children never to stray too far, and travelers were advised to respect the forest's silence. Though the doctor was gone, his obsession had left behind not just the hybrids, but a permanent echo of unnatural life, a shadow over the land that refused to fade, a reminder that some experiments, once begun, cannot be contained, and that the consequences of tampering with the natural order can endure far longer than the hand that set them in motion.